It is with my pleasure to introduce our panelists here this afternoon. To my immediate right is Dr. Julia Young. She's professor here at Catholic University in the Department of History. To her right is Jordan Denari Duffner, who is at the Bridge Initiative, which is housed at Georgetown University. And I have to do a special word of thanks to panelists on the far right, Chris Hale, who's with Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good. He's a last-minute pinch hitter because unfortunately Elizabeth Brunig had an emergency and was unable to come. So thank you very much, Chris, for coming last minute. Our panelists are going to deliver short 3 to 5 minute introductory talks, and then we'll engage in a dialogue and then invite you guys to have your questions be read. So we'll start with Dr. Young.
Hi there. 3 to 5 minutes. So, I think as a historian, I've been particularly fascinated by the slogan, "Make America Great Again." Obviously, it's had a lot of currency for a lot of people, including people on the alt-right. And for a historian, it's really fascinating because it's got the word "again" in it. So it asks us to think about, who was America great for and when? What was the period that we're trying to recreate or going back to? And as a historian I'm a historian of Mexico, but I study Mexican migration to the United States. And so, and in particular, I look at the 1920s and 1930s. And so from my perspective, what I see is a lot of parallels between the America of the 1920s and 30s and the envisioned America, of the Trump campaign, particularly with regard to immigration restriction, and nativism. So nativism is a word that gets tossed around a lot and not defined all that much, and you can sort of substitute xenophobia sometimes for the word nativism. I tend to think of it as a tendency to categorize groups of people as non-natives, as outsiders, and as dangerous or threatening to the native group. So the 1920s and 1930s saw a very large spike in nativism and an increasing effort by the US government, with the support of many in the US public sphere, to target and restrict specific groups of immigrants. I can go later into the specific legislation, but make it very quick, the legislation basically between the 1880s and 1924 restricted greater and greater groups of immigrants and eventually restricted immigrants by their nation of origin. So they were national origins quota laws that were implemented in the 1920s. With regard to Mexican migrants, there was a lot of antipathy towards them, but they weren't included in the immigration legislation of the time. That was partly due to the agricultural lobby, which fought to make sure that Mexicans could continue to come and provide cheap labor. However, after the Great Depression in 1929, when there was less of a need for labor, that nativism expanded to include Mexican migrants as well, and so the 1930s saw waves of restrictions directed towards Mexicans, and especially waves of rounding up and deportations, and those are known collectively as the repatriations of the 1930s. So I certainly see a lot of parallels between then and now. To get to the point about the role of the Catholic Church and of Catholics, there was also a movement by the Catholic Church, specifically by the bishops of the Catholic Church, to advocate for and speak out for immigrants, for all of the immigrants that were being targeted by this legislation, and for Mexicans who were being targeted by the repatriation drives. And the National Catholic Welfare Conference, which is the predecessor organization to the USCCB, or a predecessor organization, formed the Immigration Bureau in 1919, I believe. And which had a main office in DC and then local offices around the country, and staffed it with people whose entire job was to speak out on behalf of immigrants, to defend them, to try to provide legal counsel and legal defense to get them legalized, and especially to reunite families. The explicit goal of the Immigration Bureau always was to keep families together, and that was the rationale for, or one of the key rationales for defending immigrants. So that story of the 1920s and 1930s is a really sad one, and I remember sitting in the archives reading really tragic letters from Mexican families that had been split up after being deported in the 1930s, people writing and saying, you know, I can't, I'm separated from my children, I'm separated from my husband, and that seems to me, it's just echoing so directly to that time period. But at the same time, the role of the Catholic Church was also so important, and so I hope that that is the direction that the Catholic Church will take today. It's certainly the bishops are speaking out already against these tendencies of nativism and against the immigration executive orders, but you know, not all Catholics think the same, and so it will be, I think Maria's point earlier about the inclusive Catholic Americanism versus exclusive is very, very relevant for today. So I'll stop there, but I have lots more to talk about if people have questions.
Great. Well, is this on? Good. Okay. First, I'd like to thank Millennial and the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies here at CUA for hosting this really important event and for the invitation to participate. So I've been asked to talk about the overlap between Islamophobia and the alt-right, and what Catholics have to do with all of this. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there's been a lot of conversation among Catholics recently about Steve Bannon, his views on Islam, and the worldview that he seems to share with Cardinal Burke, that was referenced a little bit earlier, Steve Bannon's views on Islam. And I agree with many of the Catholic commentators who believe that, you know, Bannon and Burke's views have very little impact on the Vatican, on the church hierarchy, and that Pope Francis really doesn't tolerate or agree with this vision of an existential war between Islam and Christianity that we find in the alt-right, and particularly in Steve Bannon. However, these views about Islam are often tolerated, I have found, among American Catholics. They often find a home in Catholic media and institutions here in the United States, and that's what I want to talk a little bit about in my remarks. So what I want to do is highlight some of the key features of the alt-right view of Islam, and then demonstrate how, in part, these ideas have made their way into American Catholic discourse on Islam. I'll do this quickly and then get to some of the solutions, hopefully, during the discussion and the Q&A. So how does the alt-right see Islam? Well, it's the same way that anti-Muslim groups do. The alt-right's view of Islam and that of anti-Muslim organizations is one and the same. And if you take a look at Breitbart, you'll see this. Those who have worked for anti-Muslim groups, anti-Muslim hate groups labeled by the SPLC in that way, have had a platform on Breitbart for years. And the following is the narrative that they give voice to. That Islam is inherently violent, misogynistic, and intolerant. Basically, everything bad that Muslims do must have its basis in their religion. 2, that Islam is not a part of the Judeo-Christian West, that it's foreign, that there's no shared values or history, that Muslims seek to impose their way of life on us and to change us, and that Islam is not a religion but a political ideology. On Breitbart and elsewhere, we'll also find more specific claims, like Muslims want to bring Sharia to America, and Sharia is always portrayed as, you know, this awful, monolithic, unchanging legal system, when in fact its meaning for Muslims is quite different. And there's also this notion that Muslims can't be trusted, that their organizations are front groups for terrorism, that they're just using interreligious dialogue as a means of stealth or civilization jihad. And these are phrases that are actually used on Breitbart and elsewhere. And if some of this doesn't sound unfamiliar or strange to you, it's because I think that this alt-right Islamophobic narrative about Islam has become so mainstream. And that's not just because of the administration, but because anti-Muslim groups and activists have long promoted this narrative. And I think it shapes our media and our politics both on the right and on the left. We also find these narratives and these voices in Catholic media. And when I was working on this report for the Bridge Initiative, which I have some copies of if people are interested in it, I noticed that some Catholic news outlets and institutions and public figures have put forward in an explicit way this message about Islam. One of Steve Bannon's favorite commentators on Islam, someone who he considers an expert, is Robert Spencer. This is Robert Spencer, not the Richard Spencer we were talking about earlier. So I'll make clear, when I say Spencer going forward, I'm talking about Robert Spencer. He runs a website called Jihad Watch and co-runs a group considered by the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League to be an anti-Muslim hate group. If you remember the Ground Zero Mosque controversy or the Draw Muhammad cartoon contest or the controversial subway ads we had here in DC, those campaigns were all orchestrated by Spencer and this group. And Spencer's narrative about Islam mirrors what you'll find on Breitbart. He's written for it. He's been on Bannon's radio shows for Breitbart. And Spencer is also Catholic. He's written for and been cited as an expert in numerous Catholic publications in recent years. Some of these include Our Sunday Visitor, Catholic Answers, Homiletics and Pastoral Review, Crisis Magazine, Catholic World Report, and Church Militant. And if you think these are just, a few outlets or some fringe outlets, I suggest taking a walk over to the National Basilica Bookstore or the Catholic Information Center downtown, because you will find Robert Spencer's books sold by these institutions. Spencer has also given numerous talks at Franciscan University of Steubenville, some of which have aired on EWTN. And his work and his views have been promoted by prominent Catholic figures like Scott Hahn, Al Cresta, and Father Mitch Pacwa. All of this is documented in the Bridge Initiative report that we released in the fall. So this is just one example of what concerns me right now about how alt-right Islamophobia has made its way into Catholic discourse. A majority of American Catholics don't know Muslims personally, and their religious literacy about Islam is not great. So, it's my fear that many Catholics are not simply primed for this alt-right message about Islam, but that they're already exposed to it and consuming it.
Thank you for having me. I apologize that I was late. I am a pinch hitter, so I hope the fact that I haven't done my homework and going off the cuff won't pinch you. My name is Christopher Hale. I run Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good. We are a lay organization with 70,000 members throughout the nation, what we call grass top leaders. These are folks who engage in the social mission of the Catholic Church in public life and in politics, particularly their local politics. The question that was posed to me 2 hours ago was, what can the Catholic Church do? What can the people of God do to oppose the alt-right? So I'm going to do a quiz. The only people that can answer this quiz, I'm a co-founder of Millennial, which Robert Christian is the editor of and host of the event. The only people that can answer this quiz have to be under 40. So I'm going to say something, I want you to tell me where it comes from. It's not from the Bible because we're Catholics, so we know better. The joys and the hopes, the suffering and the anxieties of the people of this age, particularly those who are most afflicted in any way, are the joys and the hopes and the sufferings and anxieties of the followers of Christ. All right, you have to be under 40. Gaudium et Spes. So, of course, which is the great document of the Second Vatican Council about how the church is to operate in the modern world. I don't think Gaudium et Spes was alone to say that. I mean, if we think about the very birth of the church, Mary of Magdala goes from what was the tomb of Jesus to see the risen body, and Jesus says, go tell my brothers, go be with them, go tell them what's happened, go encounter their joys and hopes, sufferings and anxieties. I think that we spend a lot of time intellectualizing the alt-right, and I think that's dangerous. I think we need to actually engage with the joys and the hopes, the sufferings and anxieties, because first and foremost, the alt-right is people. They're people of the United States who, because of their political power, elected Donald John Trump, the 45th president of the United States. There's something there. I want to tell two stories to highlight this, and then we can unpack it later. First story is I want to tell about my dad. So my dad was born in 1953 in rural Kentucky. He grew up in a Democratic household, like all rural Kentucky was in the 1950s and 60s. His father was of the age that he both fought in World War I and World War II, so a double veteran. Because of that, though my grandfather died when my father was in 8th grade, my father, though he was an average student, didn't have much desire to go to school after high school, wanted to follow in his father's footsteps, even though they grew up in destitute poverty. That was all he had to dream for himself. But the United States made a decision after World War II. They said, we're going to invest in our people. We're going to invest in those who have fought in wars and their families. And so my father was able to take his dad's GI Bill, he never used it, he died, and slip in the bottom of Western Kentucky University, where he married a woman of much more means, and he had a family. And he made more money, and his son, me, my first boss was the President of the United States. That's pretty remarkable if you think about that is possible because society, government, the taxpayers, the people of the United States said, we're going to invest in this man. We're going to invest in this child. When we invest, good things happen. Here's the irony of that story. I could tell that story in a very similar way about growing up in a Catholic family, seeing a father go through joys and sufferings, hopes and anxieties, who also, like my dad, lost his job after the Great Recession, and could say that his boss is today the President of the United States, and that's Stephen Bannon. Isn't it interesting that my first boss was Barack Obama, his boss is Donald John Trump. We're both Catholics. We're both somehow profoundly affected by this faith tradition, yet we've come on very different sides of this equation, seen very different sides of this equation. All that's to say is, I think we need to understand better, as Catholics, how did Steve Bannon come to be? And how did the alt-right come to be? There is something there that they have misresponded to, but there's something real there that they are responding to. This is an intellectual movement, sure. There are intellectual forces at play, absolutely, but these are human beings. One quick aside, the joys and the hopes, the sufferings and the anxieties of today's people, particularly those the most afflicted, are the joys and the hopes, the sufferings and anxieties of the followers of Christ. About a year and a half ago, I was part of a group of Catholics that met with Joe Biden right around when the Pope was coming to the United States. And do we all remember the drama of September 2015 outside of Francis coming to the United States? It was Joe going to run? Was he in? Was he going to do it? I was all in on that. I really wanted it to happen. And so I was asked to put together a memo for him on what's the vision? Why are we doing that? I used that line, I paraphrased from that line from the Second Vatican Council. I think the best politicians, the politicians that will win, are the ones who share the joys and the hopes, the sufferings and anxieties of the American people. Particularly as a young Catholic, we can smell inauthenticity from a mile away. Sincerity matters. And I think there's knowledge from sincerity, there's wisdom from sincerity. So for the church going forward, and I'll unpack it a little bit more, if the social teaching of the church is real, we need to engage it from below.
Thank you guys very much. I'm going to start off questioning in no particular order, but I want to throw this